Welcome back to Finding the Edge podcast. I'm Garrett Boyum, and today we have Rafe Kelley on as a guest. I met Rafe, or I learned about Rafe through Emergence and their Sport Movement Skill Conference. I believe it was during 2020 or 2021, and I was really captivated with your work and seeing how you were trying to integrate movement with how kind of to engage the whole person. And also you were doing martial arts as well. And so it was really cool to see how you were integrating these ideas within the movement practice that kind of engage the whole person and help people kind of connect with one another. And so I saw immediately kind of a connection to baseball and how that could potentially be integrated into a team setting to help build culture. And so I'm super excited to have you on. And I was just wondering if you could kind of give kind of an intro to people to who you are, your background, and then also too, how'd you find ecological dynamics in these ideas, and what drew you to those and to wanting to incorporate them into your work?
Yeah. So I am the founder of something called Evolve Move Play, it's a method really for the cultivation of meaning in life and wisdom and virtue through physical practices as our base. And it grew out of my background as a parkour teacher and a martial arts student and teacher. I started training martial arts when I was 6 years old. I've been through a variety of different martial arts. And then I became like a pretty early adopter of MMA. What was it, 96? I was training in a mixture of kickboxing, BJJ, that kind of stuff, and picked up that perspective and was following the UFC early on. I was training gymnastics throughout my teens. And then when I was 23, I was one of the first maybe 100 or so athletes to pick up parkour in the United States and became one of the first generations of coaches and community leaders in the parkour community. And then I always had a really deep interest in movement in nature, particularly. That was something that was seen in the earliest parkour videos, but as parkour spread worldwide, it really became very associated with the urban environment. So I was really interested in taking it back. And then also, what is the intersection of martial arts and parkour? And I became very interested in research on play, specifically through the work of a man named Frank Forencich and another one named Stuart Brown. I happened to get to meet and spend some time with Frank early on, and his work became very influential for me. So I was incorporating these ideas around play and around parkour and around martial arts. And I became aware of Méthode Naturelle, which is an older French method of physical culture, which included not just that parkour elements, stuff similar to parkour, but also included the martial arts elements and was also focused on movement in nature primarily. And so that I didn't really get exposed to much of the ideas between Méthode Naturelle, just a really basic schema, but I started incorporating it and trying to engage with it. So then I essentially started taking all that work, and I was also encouraged by Ido Portal, who was a big kind of huge influencer in the movement world early on, that this sort of melange of things I was putting together was worth bringing out and sharing with the world. And so Ido became an influence of mine in that idea of the movement perspective. And so I took off and started teaching this stuff. And what I discovered was that the kind of gymnastics pedagogy that I had been brought up in, and the more traditional martial arts pedagogy that I had been brought up in, I had translated into the parkour space and had success like building progressions and helping athletes grow as parkour athletes using that. And most of the coaches who were starting parkour at that time, they really had no pedagogical background at all. So they didn't have any real approach to skill development. A lot of times it was just, hey, do what I do, right? And so I was able to break things down into pieces and sort of build progressions and drills and do some of these things, and it was working. But when I started going into training people in nature, I started noticing that some of the things that I wanted to do as a drill were just getting figured out by the athletes because of the context. And so I would be looking at going through this whole sequence of skill progressions to achieve a skill with somebody. And then I would just put them in a different environment and they'd just do the skill to solve a problem. And it was really an interesting ego check because I thought I was this incredibly brilliant coach who knew so much and had all of these pieces that I could offer people. And I was like, half the shit that I'm doing is unnecessary. Right. And so I could have kind of tried to limit it in some way and make it work, the stuff that I was doing. But I was literally at this really amazing set of trees in San Francisco, and it just like everything I wanted to teach just didn't make any sense. And so I like sat for 4 hours and was thinking about how to do this, and then I just came up with a different way to do it. And I started thinking about this idea of how can I trick students into learning skills instead of spoon feeding it to them? How do I use the environment to bring the skill forward? And this was before I'd ever been exposed to any of Bernstein or Gibson or any of that stuff. So it was actually a student of mine named Michael Tankovich, who was a PT for the Seattle Seahawks, who came to one of my workshops, and he asked me if I'd ever heard about ecological dynamics. And I said no. And he said, well, you should look into it because what you're doing looks very like it. And for whatever reason, the first thing I picked up was actually Franz Bosch's book, Strength and Coordination Integrated Approach. And that kind of gave me the basic idea. And I was really slow to integrate stuff at first, in the sense that I was kind of figuring stuff out on my own, and I didn't want to overload myself with theory. So I would just take in like a really basic idea and play with it and see what happened and just kind of stay skin in the game. And so the ideas developed for a long time. And then I found Rob Gray's work, and I went into this period where I went from, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of Bosch, try it here, to like, I'm going to just consume everything that Rob Gray's ever put online. And now I'll have a theory behind what I do. And then I picked up Bernstein and Gibson. And also, interestingly, I had this whole other realm of interest in like how movement practices aligned with wisdom cultivation and virtue and character and meaning, which was happening because I was teaching these long workshops and noticing how much they changed people in ways that were unrelated to skill acquisition. And through that, I encountered Jordan Peterson's work, and that became very interesting. And Peterson, it turned out, had a huge influence from J.J. Gibson, which most people don't realize. And so through Peterson, I got into J.J. Gibson and was seeing like two different lenses sort of offering ecological dynamics to me. And then I became friends with John Vervaeke, who's the head of cognitive science at the University of Toronto, or was the director of cognitive science. And he's part of the 4E cognitive science lineage, which is also downstream of Gibson. And so he was a student of one of Gibson's direct students, and that's been like absolutely fundamental to his stuff. So I've come to Gibson and the ecological approach from like many different weird streams. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I got involved in all this stuff. And I've also played with it both in the martial arts sense, in the like general movement sense, and then in parkour specifically as well.
So one of the things that you brought up was like the incorporation of play. Now, did you kind of come into the ideas of play before you encountered ecological dynamics? Was that what you're...
Yeah.
So
yeah,
kind of with that, what do you see as like the role of play, and how does play work within skill development?
So I think that play, one way to conceptualize play is as an inherent drive that an organism has for self-education. And so my wife, actually, Beth Kelley, she did her master's thesis on parkour as a form of adult play, which you can find out there if you want to. And so she was looking at Piaget and Panksepp and all these figures actually before I was. And so she turned me on to those ideas. And so we started really thinking about what is attracting people to parkour, what makes parkour powerful and unique, how does it relate to things like skateboarding and snowboarding and these other sports. And at the time, of course, flow sports is the big concept. We've got, Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheel talking about the Flow Genome Project and the rise of the Superman and all this. And because of Beth's work, I was like, I think a lot of what people are talking about in flow is actually better conceptualized in some sense as play.
Do you want to describe to what flow is and these flow sports and kind of what is the flow state?
Yeah. So the flow state is something that was identified by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi as a state of optimal experience. People go to do rock climbing. They go to do all these things that seem kind of miserable on the surface or risky, but they end up having these really profound states of consciousness that are experienced as really beneficial. And so flow state is associated with loss of its perception of time, complete kind of captured in the moment, high mood. And what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi found when he looked at it is that many different activities can engage and create a flow state. You can have a flow state with writing, but it has to do with the balance between your effort level and your competence level. So when you're operating in the optimal zone of high competence and high challenge, you can access this mental state, which is associated with very high performance, is very rewarding to be engaged in, and seems to be associated with extremely rapid learning. And it can be contrasted with anxiety states, which are states where your competence is insufficient for the level of challenge that you're in, or states of boredom where your competence is well above what's necessary for the task and starts to become drudgerous and boring to do. So one thing that we can see as far as play is that play is a natural drive that really all animals have, but we especially see it in young animals. We especially see it in highly social and highly intelligent animals. It's prolonged throughout life. And they're essentially driven to engage in behaviors that are, I think, evolutionarily coded to be specific to the adaptive kind of capacities of that species and what it needed to do, that are inherently self-education. They find the flow state, and in that, they're then engaged in behavior that opens up their capacity to do things, right? So every animal basically engages in locomotor play. At least all fairly complex animals engage in locomotor play, which is essentially just exploring what the landscape affords you. And so, like a classic example to use a Jordan Peterson example is a great one. You take a rat and you drop it into a new environment. The first thing that it will do is freeze. It does not feel like it has competence. It's not sure what's threatening in the environment. It doesn't know what's going on. So the first reaction is total anxiety, complete shutdown. When nothing eats it right away, nothing dangerous happens, it starts to explore a little bit. And so then it'll engage in exploratory behavior. And Jaak Panksepp was able to start to look at the underlying neurology of these different motivational states. And he found that exploration is distinct from play. So that exploratory drive to understand the environment they're in, it's motivating and it's rewarding, but it's not the same as the play circuitry in his research. So you imagine that rat moves through its enclosure and it discovers there's water in this part of their enclosure. There's a good nesting area. There's some areas it can climb up and maybe have the potential to escape from a predator if a predator were to come into the environment. Identifies all the resources. So it'll create a kind of like a routine of it can go from here to there and get all the things that it wants. But over time, it'll start varying its behavior and exploring different options in the environment. And that's where we're starting to see play. It's jumping on things, not because it needs to get somewhere, but just to jump. And this is very strange from an evolutionary perspective because it's wasting calories and energy. It's exposing itself to the risk of injury. Why is it doing this? So my wife's research, she looked at like macaques and other primates and found that like macaques will run routes like parkour athletes run routes through the environment over and over again. And there's probably many different layers of benefit to such behavior. One way of thinking about it is that they are exploring the affordances in that environment that then can become relevant if a functional task is associated with it. So if you have run to the edge of every branch in your environment, then you're going to know what that branch what the loading capacity of that branch is and how far out on you can get if a big cat or a snake is now in the environment. Or on the other hand, if you need to you want to catch a bird or catch a smaller animal, catch an insect, you know what that environment offers. And so that behavior, there's a reward for exploratory sort of variable behavior. And one of that is locomotor play. So then you have things like rough and tumble play, which is essentially chasing behavior, tackling behavior, aggression behavior, but in a playful way. And then there's object-oriented play, which is manipulating objects. So human beings, because we are a tool-using species, engage in a lot more of this than most other species. But a lot of species engage in object-oriented play. Crows will find shiny things and just take them for no reason. They will spin feathers about. Have you ever seen a video of a bear playing with a stick, just spinning a stick around? kung fu bears, right? Bears will do all sorts of stuff. Obviously, chimps play with objects. So if you imagine just a little kid going about their daily routine, it's like they're going to climb up on top of the couch and jump off of it, and that's going to be fun for them. And they're going to want to wrestle with a sibling or a parent, and they're going to pick things up and throw them and spin things around and mess with their hands and break all your stuff because they're exploring what their body is afforded in relationship to the environment, which then becomes the grounds in which they have well-attuned agent-arena relationships that specify the affordances in an environment and the action capabilities of the organism. So that's my thinking about play, if that makes sense.
Anytime I've heard you speak about this, I'm always sitting here going, why don't I just completely change all of the warm-up stuff that we're doing, right? Because it's fun, it's engaging, and we're doing a lot of it. And I've noticed that, but sometimes, just quite frankly, both in my own soul, as well as when I'm presenting this to other coaches, I just spoke with some of our Little League coaches about how can we sort of redeem the warm-up that's so static and boring to be more problem-solving oriented and creating adaptable athletes instead of just, pretty rote repetition. But I still, even to myself, sometimes struggle because it's like, well, we're just playing games. But I think the reason I say that is because you draw a really awesome line in that example from, I've explored everything in my territory so that when a predator tries to come get me, I know I really have a great connection to the environment. For us as more sport specific coaches, what would you say? What does that look like for us when we're working with two of us are college age athletes and one is professional athletes? And so we have a pretty narrow base, and yet we know it's beneficial to go outside of that. And yet we have time constraints with our athletes. And so would you speak towards that? What does this look like for more sport specific coaches? How do they apply some things like this?
Yeah. So I think you're trying to balance. So there's a play, let's say, has natural dimensions that aren't necessarily perfectly aligned with the kind of KPIs of a given sport, right? So what's optimally fun is not always optimally developmental for the needs of a given athlete, right? So you could be like, okay, well, if we play tackle basketball as part of our warm-up, we'll get really high motivational state, a really strong buy-in from our athletes, but maybe we'll have a substantially increased injury rate and we're not going to see an adaptation in increasing that, like how fast the hip turns over during their swing that's relevant enough for what we're doing. So we can look at play as a resource, and then we can try to tie it in, right? And you guys are familiar with ecological dynamics perspectives. So you understand the idea of like, how do we harvest positive variation and eliminate negative variation? So a lot of times play is inherently about going out and harvesting that positive variation. So what I would sort of approach this, if I was in that position, is like, how do I design games that like optimally fulfill the function of a given warm-up activity that help the athlete identify solutions that are relevant to the sports context that you're playing in, right? And that minimize injury risk to the degree possible, right? So I'm not going to be like, okay, let's start with parkour on top of bars 10 feet off the ground and full MMA sparring, right? So okay, the risk-reward ratio isn't there for the type of athlete that you're working with. But that doesn't mean that you can't design a parkour-based activity that is highly context-specific and fun, or even some level of rough and tumble play that is limited enough to keep it safe for the athletes and maybe exposes them to a kind of behavior that is going to help them identify things. So for instance, I was just thinking about this, I don't know why, but I was thinking about preparing athletes to hit the ground, right? So if you're baseball is not a contact sport, except it is in a way, right? You're going to run into the catcher, you're going to run into the outfield walls, you're going to run into the ground repeatedly, you're going to jump in the air and impact. So it's like, how well does the athlete manage collisions? How do I introduce something that's going to improve the athlete's ability to manage collisions in chaotic, complex situations that's scalable to the point that they're going to be safe, right? So I've been playing flag football. I'm like, man, I'd really love to play some tackle football, but I don't really want to get hurt. So I was like, how could I change the constraints of tackle football to make it much less likely that I'm going to get hurt? Well, how often do people get hurt on a one-on-one tackle versus when it's in a group tackle, right? Like when you really see guys get hurt in the NFL, usually it's because they're pinned between two people. So what's a basic constraint set that we can have? We can have small-sided games. If you want to make tackle football safer, play 4-on-4 instead of 11-on-11. You want to have more interactions? Make the field smaller. You want the impact to be less dangerous? Make the surface softer. I love to play tackle games on sand. Right? Have you guys ever seen Indian mud wrestling? It's a great constraint to work with. Like the difference between grappling on mud versus grappling on concrete, it's completely different, right? The danger level is absurdly different. So we could think about the same thing with playing football, right? If you're on a evenly sort of slippery and soft surface, you can't generate the forces that you can generate when you're going really fast. If athletes are going 21 miles per hour and they're having to stop on a dime and change direction, like the ratio of non-contact injuries is going to be higher just because the forces moving through the body are higher. So these are kind of constraints that I would like to play with. And then I don't know the specifics of the problems that you're trying to address with your athletes. So I think that working with me and playing with, I can be the variation and then you can be the specification. Okay, but does that give us an adaptation across this variable that we need to generate more action capability, that we need to generate more positive variation awareness? That's where the sports coach, I think, can really hone in the use of the games.
As I'm thinking about that, when it comes to, since they're pitching coaches, I'm starting to think about, okay, how do I warm up the shoulder joint? So does that looks like maybe more crawling activities, that could look like some climbing activities, some hanging, some swinging. When I'm thinking, I'm also trying to think about, for me, when I'm trying to incorporate these ideas into the warm-up, I'm trying to think about, okay, how do I open up their cognitive degrees of freedom as well to be, because for me, when I go into the beginning part of my session, I want our athletes to explore. And more specifically, I want them to explore in the cage with the bat and how they're moving in relationship to the ball and how they're trying to intercept the ball with the bat. And I'm thinking about, okay, what types of warm-up activities could I do that, one, gets them kind of creative and frees up their movement so that they feel a little bit more free when they get into the batter's box of, okay, how can I move myself? And even too, just to establish and getting kind of engaging there, like, okay, this is one of the questions that I kind of wanted to talk to you about as well, is you in your last Sport Movement Skill Conference presentation talked about the components of coordination, and you talked about rhythm, direction of inertia, and displacement. And so when I'm thinking about the warm-up element, I'm also thinking about, like, how can I incorporate those elements in there so that they're already beginning to attend to that and how they're moving. So I guess my question to you is, like, how could I potentially design in some tasks that kind of free them up? Because what I see a lot of our guys, when they start hitting and they want to go easy, they tend to stand up more. So their center of mass is higher, which then means that pitches that are not kind of right exactly kind of like belt high or higher, it's harder for them to get to. And then they have, because they're starting higher, they have a less likelihood, or that affordance for that pitch that's down low. It's not very inviting because it's so far away. And so I guess, do you have any thoughts on ways that we could incorporate activities? So for example, what I thought for infielders, hand soccer, as a way to engage them to move in different ways. And the activity is naturally going to keep them low because they're going to have to use their hands to go for the ball. And then they're going to naturally have these shuffle crossover patterns as they go and go for the ball. And so when I'm thinking about, well, what does the hitting version of that look like to engage them? Do I pick a different implement? Because this is easy for pitchers. You can pick up different implements to throw. But for a hitter, do I go for a different implement? Are we trying to catch a ball? Or I guess that's where I'm trying to think about, what does it look like for a hitter to try to warm up their degrees of freedom when it comes to intercepting things. Because again, it comes back to like when we talked about, maybe we brought up rope flow. I can't remember if we brought it up before whether we started recording or not at that point. But one of the challenges of rope flow is that there's a high bar to learn even some basic moves. Just doing a dragon roll can take some time just to learn that. So similarly, like when we're talking about, okay, do I want to do something like wiffle ball? Well, in order to do wiffle ball and to throw all these different pitches, that's a high skill activity that somebody's going to be able to have to learn how to do. So then it becomes like, I guess that's my question here is like, how do I find an entry level activity that anybody can jump into right away?
Yeah. So the question about like wiffle ball reminds me of like Olympic lifts. Is the skill that it requires the skill development that it requires to be able to use the tool effectively worth whatever extra benefit there is versus some other tool that's easier, right? Mm-hmm. And coming up, influenced by CrossFit, influenced by functional movement, all this stuff. Like I was a huge anti-machine guy. And, it's like more and more now I'm like, I'm going to get so much movement, so much athletic development, so much movement and coordination demand from my sport. Like when I go work on a muscle, like I don't really care, right? I'm just like, if the best tool for the job is a leg extension machine at that time, like I'm not going to be less coordinated because I'm using a leg extension machine. That's not where, right? Like the squat versus leg extension machine has very little to do with the overall coordinated demand of my particular practice. For somebody who's trying to be athletic, who's primarily using the gym, it might matter more, right? But for parkour athlete, I don't think it matters. So I think it's a real question. Like I said, I can train running on top of bars, right? 10 feet off the ground, and it's safe for me because I know how to bail. But would it be useful for me to try to teach that to a bunch of baseball players, right? Like the potential danger and the time it takes to invest in it versus whatever harvesting that adaptation for this other thing. I think that's a real question to ask. And I think there's definitely places where it's not worth it. So when you're thinking about, okay, so the first question I had is, okay, you want to warm people up, and when you ask them to go easy, they engage in a behavior that's not well coupled to the behavior as you want to see it. So one, I would say, does that actually matter? Does that change the behavior when it is actually important? I'm not sure. I think that'd be worth studying. Is okay, well, are we seeing people drift towards that if we spend more time in that mode? But the second question would be like, well, can you just constrain the behavior differently in that space? Well, what if the strike zone is from the mid shin to the belt buckle when you're doing warm-up swings? Like that'd be a really easy constraint to manipulate. They have to keep their hips lower and you don't have to go that far away. And that seems like a differential learning thing where it's, well, there's an ideal strike zone, but every freaking umpire actually has a different strike zone. So if you engage with some of this differential learning and make them get comfortable swinging at pitches like where they have to redefine it, are you actually then harvesting some positive variation that'll stabilize their performance when they're in that demand? So that would be actually the first thing that occurred to me. But if you want to play with stuff like, like tennis, ping pong, right? Change the implement. A lot of these games are kind of accessible because a lot of athletic people will have already done them. And you just say, okay, cool. And that'll depend on your athlete population and who you're working with and what their backgrounds are. And you might have a few athletes who happen to have the right background, just be like, okay, cool. I know that if you play this, you're going to be excited. You're going to have fun. It's going to be easy for you. And it's going to get this thing that we want, which is like you're moving laterally, you're staying low, and you're doing a lot of variety of swinging an implement at a ball. So let's just do that. So that, and then, you can invent other games, right? Like I really love like Jamie Smith and Austin Yoakum and some of these guys because they're really good generators. Jeremy Frisch, they're great generators of games. And you can just watch their pages basically be like, yeah, that one looks like it would help me with this thing that I want. And then you see it, does it work, right? You go, okay. I think one of the things that I've really become a believer in over the years is that rationalizing a program and putting it and forward thinking it and being really smart about that is less valuable than setting up really clear feedback signals for what you do, right? If one guy has, let's say he generates 20 good ideas out of 100, right? And the other guy generates 5 good ideas out of 100, but the guy who generates 5 good ideas out of 100 is really good at killing all his bad ideas. He's going to have a better program in the long run. And nobody's actually generating anywhere near 100 good ideas out of 100, right? So the ability to kill your bad ideas is usually more important than your ability to generate the good ones. So go ahead.
No, I just think that's a really fascinating point. I think while we're talking warm up, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you this, because I had a similar entry to you where I really dove into ecological dynamics was from Ido Portal. He kind of was the main influence during the COVID period. Just to share a quick background on it, my brother's currently a professional pitcher of the Arizona Diamondbacks, and he was going through a period where shoulder felt terrible all the time, couldn't throw strikes, and pretty much ditched the weight room, ditched traditional training, and basically went all in. Anything he found of Vito, he did. So you see lizard crawl variations, different jumps, different kind of trying to walk on railings, jump over railings, stick it, jump on the railing, this foot, that foot, just all any kind of play you could think of, any tennis ball game that you saw him kind of go with. The dude was moving for 7-8 hours a day. And then what we found happened was not only did his shoulder feel great for the first time, pretty much in the first 3 years of his college career, he was throwing strikes and throwing just as hard as he ever had. And he pretty much ditched the weight room doing it. And I was like, all right, there's got to be something here, especially when I think of the warmups and thinking about pitching. It's really hard. I think Kyle would attest to this. It's really hard to think about, all right, how do I make it specific for pitchers? Because we're throwing an object as hard as we can over and over, trying to create these different shapes. So it's really hard to do the warm up and not go over volume ourselves. So we're making it specific. So my question for you is, where do you kind of see the general just kind of movement training kind of carry over to more specifics? Because even in my own life, I've dabbled in parkour, played around with it a lot in 23, and I was seeing capabilities that I hadn't necessarily done, jumps I hadn't attempted, become options for me, even though that it wasn't technically similar to something I've done yet. But now I'm seeing it in the world. Now I can do it. And I think that was something similar to happen with my brother. Everything was general, but we're seeing it. Yeah, that we were still throwing a lot, but a ton of general stuff bled into the specific. And also his confidence was through the roof for the first time in his life. I just know I'm the best mover, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think anecdotes are always hard to completely conceptualize, right? Because if you have a long traditional strength training background and you move away from it, like just resting from that stimulus can be really beneficial. Do you guys know who Jonathan Edwards is? Jonathan Edwards is the world record holder in the triple jump. He jumped over 60 feet in the triple jump. Nobody's come close to him. It's the most beautiful expression of athleticism I swear you'll ever see. Watch this video of Jonathan Edwards jumping. And he jumped over 18 meters 3 times, in one meet, which nobody else had ever done up to that point. In the 6 months prior to Jonathan Edwards' world record, he could barely train because he had Epstein-Barr virus. So he'd been training insanely intensely for a very long period of time in a very specific way. And then he just couldn't train. And when he came back, he had the biggest performance that anybody had ever had. So you might be, I'm not saying that the movement didn't have anything to do with it, but you might actually just be seeing the rebound effect of all the training that he had already done now that you basically just gave him rest. You rested his nervous system, you rested his physical structure, you rested the overload demand on a lot of these other attributes that he'd already accumulated an enormous training age in. So if we're asking the question, how do I take a pitcher who's not a Major League Baseball pitcher and get them to where he was, the answer may be a different answer. So that's one thing. So then the next question is basically, my whole passion is, how do we create bleed from one activity to another? Right? And this is a question that exists not just in skill acquisition in sport, but skill acquisition across everything. Right? Ultimately, if we're trying to become more virtuous, more wise human beings, we want to basically say that everything we're investing in, we're trying to get it to generalize across as many domains as possible. So I think that there are certain activities that we're evolved for that have they have general coordinative impacts that are going to be positive for a lot of people. because the nervous system's set up that way, the brain, the central, it's like you start doing some crawling patterns, and a lot of people are going to figure things out and generally increase their coordination because we develop like that as children. And because it also it constrains degrees of freedom that forces you to adopt better movement solutions a lot in ways that you can compensate out of in a different context. So some of this basic ground flow stuff can be really useful for a lot of athletes. Jumping. If you're not jumping, if you're not running and sprinting, so you add those coordinated demands and it's like the system's going to get smarter. Then you have to deal with the motivational standpoint, right? If you've done pitching and weightlifting for years and you're super bored by it, you do something that's highly motivating, that motivational state is going to create a condition in which you will adapt better and faster across the board. So I don't think that we can say Ido and I have a different model here. Ido has this sort of rhizomatic model where there's some sort of general factor of movement capacity that is then accessible through doing kind of any kind of movement the right way. My understanding of the research is that the transfer if you look at IQ, right? IQ is a general factor where we see that if someone is good at math, they're likely to be good at writing. And this factor is the predominant impact across every factor of cognitive performance that we have. The interesting thing is that when you look at athletic performance, you don't see the same thing. Athletic performance is actually more domain specific than cognitive performance, as far as I understand the literature. So this idea that you have this rhizomatic structure and this general factor of movement capacity that we can address through the right kind of training across any set of demands, I think is probably mistaken. What I think is instead what you have a small world network model of movements where some movement patterns have a higher degree of transfer to other movement patterns than vice versa. So I don't know have you guys ever read my essay about the generalist mover and CrossFit? Okay, so that's a good one to read. I lay it out in detail there, but in gymnastics, there are 6 apparatus that men do, right? There's the floor exercise, the vault, the rings, the parallel bars, the high bar, and the pommel horse. Okay. So if all aspects of gymnastics were equally valuable to each other, then you would expect that experienced gymnastics coaches would spend an equal amount of time across every apparatus. But if you go work with high-level gymnastics coaches, you'll see that many of them spend 50% of their time on the floor exercise. Okay? The floor exercise has a set of asymmetrical donations to every other exercise. The exercise they spend the least amount of time on is the pommel horse, because the pommel horse has very little structural similarity to any other exercise. So now go and look at and we may have a problem of reciprocal causation here, but if you look at what is the most common individual gold medal for the all-around gold medal winner to win in the Olympics, it's the floor exercise. So if you win the all-around gymnastics championships, the most likely specialty that you have is going to be the floor exercise. The least likely is going to be the pommel horse. And we can think about this structurally, and because I have a gymnastics background, I know that this is the way to think about it. So if you want to learn a giant on the high bar, which is to swing fully around the high bar from your hands, you can begin to build the motor pattern, the motor awareness, or the awareness of the physical structure of that skill by doing a back extension roll. So you literally roll through a handstand onto your hands. That's taught on the floor, and it's a floor exercise technique. And you learn to flip on the floor. So now you learn to do a back uprise. You're mechanically rolling into a handstand, basically, on top of the bar. Then you're going to do a flip off the bar, catch the bar again. To do that on the bar requires very high skill, but I can access those skills at a lower level over on the floor exercise. Now, if we look structurally at the pommel horse skills, you're swinging yourself around by your hands. There's almost nowhere else in any athletic activity where you do something like that, except for like vaults and parkour, but it's much, much simpler. So my model is there are asymmetrical donor sports. So for instance, I would say that basketball donates better to American football than vice versa. If you play basketball, you will spend more time throwing the ball and catching the ball than will average out across every player on a football field. You will spend time doing pick and roll, which is basically playing offensive lineman and defensive lineman. So if you have to set a pick so that your ball handler can move behind you and around you, you are playing a similar role to an offensive or defensive, or to an offensive lineman. If you're navigating around picks, you're playing a defensive role that's similar to that. Now, how many times in a basketball game are you going to engage in that high leverage, highly informational experience? So if you ask basketball players and football players, how many basketball players could play in the NFL versus NFL players in the NBA? Most people will agree that there are more NBA players who could play on the other side. And I think it's because the demand actually is going to create a more generally adaptive athlete who has a lot of capacity to manipulate a ball, move through space, attack gaps, right? Take contact in a more diverse way. So a really good point guard is kind of like a running back, is kind of like a quarterback, is kind of like a wide receiver. So it's easier to take that guy and make him any of those in some sense than it is to take the wide receiver and turn him into a quarterback because he hasn't been throwing the ball all the time. So my kind of perspective is, how do we identify the highest sort of threshold donor sports? So I think parkour is one of the central donor sports because it is essentially the sport of locomotion, and every sport has a locomotive demand, right? You guys play baseball, you got to run up the wall sometimes. You got to dive over somebody sometimes. You got to deal with putting your hand on somebody to re-engage yourself. You got to spin around and be aware. So an athlete who has all of those capacities at a very high level is going to be a lot safer when they're going up. Now we add the demand of tracking the ball, which is important, and most parkour athletes don't have that. But if we combine the two, now we have a really adaptive athlete. So my kind of core model is that if you want to, my kids actually, I have children who are doing this. So my son is 11 years old. He's wrestling. He's on a ninja warrior team that does a lot of parkour, and then I teach him parkour on top of that. And then when wrestling season ends, he's going to go to rugby. I like rugby for young kids because basketball is usually too big for smaller kids to manipulate well. And so even though it's an ideal donor sport, in my opinion, it needs to be scaled down in constraints to actually work well for younger kids. So this year, because he's now almost 5 feet tall, is going to be the first year that we're going to put him in basketball in the winter. So he's going to play rugby, tackle rugby for the first time. Well, he's done, hundreds of double leg takedowns in wrestling season before he gets to it. He's been taken down over and over again, picked up and dropped. He's going to be way more comfortable, way more resilient, way more contact conditioned when it comes to that. I feel like I went on a bit of a rant. Did that actually answer your question, Garrett?
I think that was good. I guess I wanted to then kind of follow back up with what you were talking about before about what is the role of rhythm? Because when we start talking about this idea of rep without rep, I think it gets people to shy away from things that seem to have kind of like a cyclical kind of thing to it, because it feels more rote repetition when I'm doing something that has more of a rhythmic type thing. But when it comes to coordination and things kind of in a way organizing themselves well, it seems as though rhythm is a huge component to that. And so I'd be kind of curious to hear your thoughts on going back to coordination. Okay, what types of things, going back to what you're talking about with donor sports or donor movements, that can really help us educate ourselves to this notion of moving in rhythm, learning how to control your inertia and your displacement through space?
So I'm just imagining you're working with hitters, right? So there's a specific, timing is everything, right? It doesn't matter how powerful that hitter's hands are, how powerful that hitter's hips are, if they're not in the right sequence.
Or just even too, right? Like the bat has to go through the right space, right? In order for you to, so it's not just because so much of how a lot of coaches think about hitting is it's all about timing. And I actually think that's just half the equation. You can be perfectly on time, but be in completely the wrong place. And so it doesn't really matter. So to me, it's all about time and place. But part of what enables an athlete to learn how to be in time and place is, in my mind, rhythm. So much of what a lot of coaches do is they're like, oh, you have too much movement, so we need to simplify it. But then when you pull out the movement, you're actually pulling out the rhythm. So you're actually making them less rhythmic, and they're having to move more rigidly or more statically in order to now try to figure out how to coordinate through space. So if you take away all that rich information that they get through moving and having some sort of rhythm, then all of a sudden, to me, like, you're actually making the system harder to actually figure out how to coordinate things. And yes, there's some of a timing component to it, but because this, I think, is the other thing that, for me, from an ecological perspective, like a lot of the things that you're talking about when we're talking about donor sports, there are invariants through these different sports, and you learning how to navigate space as you become better able to pick up the invariants within the space and how you move through space. And because it's kind of this whole concept of the methods, they may be a million, but the principles are few. So when you start to understand the principles of movement and how to navigate space, all of a sudden, what can seem very complex, I think we were talking about in a different podcast, there was this pilot who is trying to land a big 4-engine jet that was missing an engine, or that had a damaged engine. And they're having lots of issues within the cockpit, and they're trying to figure out, okay, well, all these problems. But then he started asking the question, well, what actually works, right? Because there's just so many problems. It's really overwhelming. And then he came to this one conclusion too, is, you know what if I think about this as one of the basic planes that I learned to fly at the beginning and just really simplify it? And so that to me is him taking a very complex situation and boiling it down to what are the main invariants of flying an airplane. And I think that kind of comes back to the same thing of, once you begin to understand there are these basic principles to how to move through space, all of a sudden, things that seem to be super complex, the expert is able to actually, they're the ones that are able to pick out what information they actually need to focus on and where they need to focus their attention. And so, so anyways, that's kind of where I was curious, your thoughts on coordination and how do we actually learn how to move ourselves through space?
So if we think about rhythm, we can have a basic thing of, this is a basic 4/4 rhythmic structure, right? And can an athlete replicate it? Can they stay on beat? But of course, if we want to have higher level movement capacities, it's not about this really simple set of beats, right? That's just a beginning, right? And so in all these things as well, jazz drummers don't doing the simple thing. People who are highly skilled at rhythm like to manipulate and do very intricate things with their rhythm. And so when I think about rhythm in parkour, it's actually very complicated, right? Because you're running, and that has a very simple rhythm. But now, as soon as I am doing just a jump, right? Just think about a basic long jump. What's actually happening those last two steps is that you're manipulating the basic rhythmic structure of gait in order to create a stronger rebound off the ground to optimize like vertical force transfer. Well, an athlete, if you take an athlete who's never really done long jump and you ask them to go long jump into a pit, what you'll see is that they can't shift the rhythm of the penultimate and ultimate step effectively, and so they don't get very much pop. So what is learning to long jump? It's just literally learning to manipulate that rhythmic structure. And obviously there's other things like how fast can you run and how elastic are the tendons and adaptations that have to do with it. But that's the rhythmic structure. So now in parkour, I've got a running jump, but then I have a running jump where I'm going to land on one leg versus a running jump where I'm going to land on 2 feet. And then I have a vault, like a Kong vault, which is quite complex rhythmically. So now you add the fact, okay, if I'm a long jumper, I'm going to do, say, a 13-step approach. And every time that I do it is a 13-step approach. But if I'm a parkour and my 13-step approach is the exact same distance, or I can manipulate it slightly based on how I feel that day, right? I might move it back a foot or 3 feet because I'm poppier, or for some reason I'm not arriving at the board where I need to and I shorten it. But basically I'm working with a very constrained set of distances. Now, as a parkour athlete, my run-up distances are often off of the natural length of my footwork, right? So if I'm just going to accelerate as hard as possible for 4 steps and take off into a jump, then because of my leg length and how fast I am and whatever, my acceleration capacity, there's going to be an optimal distance of steps that's going to get me to the right place at the right time. Now, if I just did a vault and I have only this amount of space to organize myself, then I have to adjust the length of my steps to get the right amount of steps in the right amount of time. So I have to shave a little bit off this step or add something to that step in order to do that. So that's a manipulation of my rhythm in order to arrive at the right place at the right time. So as we move up in the complexity of parkour, when I'm, say, doing a corkscrews, stepping down into a step vault, into a cat leap, whatever, what's actually happening is that my ability to shift the rhythmic structure and the time it takes me to complete where my body is in a given part of that, and the degrees of freedom around it, that's what I'm gaining in complexification, right? And so by regularly exposing myself to those kinds of challenges, obviously I'm going to become much more competent in that. Somebody who only ever runs the same amount of steps across the same distance is inherently not going to have the same capacity to adapt to a variable and constrained run-up. You guys know Cliff Harsky?
Not familiar with him.
Okay. Cliff Harsky's he's a kettlebell guy, but he's a really smart movement guy, and he's a really funny guy. He's a good guy. But he says Devin Hester is the greatest runner in the world, not Usain Bolt. Because Devin Hester has to solve a far more complex motor landscape than Usain Bolt does.
What's unique about him?
Devin Hester? Mm-hmm. Well, he's just one of the best kick returners in NFL history. You can pick any number of other kick returners whoever it is. But the idea is that from an ability to solve motor problems while running perspective, there's probably nothing that is more complex and more dangerous in some sense than what Devin Hester does. And so he's solving a more complex set of motor problems. So he's got to be able to change direction. He has to be able to manipulate rhythm. He has to be able to hesitate. He has to be able to juke people out. He has to be able to do all these things while running really fast. So to go back to your question about, or like in your context, what do I, as a pitcher, what I want to do is I want to break the hitter's feeling of rhythm. I want to make him feel disorganized. I want him to basically get out of his sort of like effective wells of movement. I want to move him into the chaotic landscape where his timing is off. So then reciprocally, if you're a hitter, what do you want to be able to do? You want to be able to identify the higher order invariants that specify the information that allow you to access your consistent rhythm so that you can arrive at the right place at the right time.
Because I mean, even from personal experience, when I feel connected or like when my body gets into certain positions, it almost feels like the thing just happens by itself. And so that's where, to me, it becomes about how do I present different problems, or how can I educate their attention or intention? Oftentimes, I think it's intention. How can I educate their intention such that their system can now start to organize and find a way to better connect with the environment? Because like you're mentioning with when it comes to the parkour stuff, it can be very complicated, but in the moment, right, everything is scaled to our body actions, right? As the environment around us becomes bigger based upon our stride length, all this sort of stuff, we're able to begin to understand, okay, I'm based upon my intention, I'm going to need to start to manipulate my rhythm of my gait to prep for the jump, etc. But anyway, so I don't know if you have any kind of closing thoughts on that, but that's kind of how I'm thinking about is, okay, what are the types of problems that I want to try to set up, or where do I want to educate an athlete's intention to help them begin to explore how their rhythm, they're controlling their inertia and their displacement through space to help them better connect with the environment?
Yeah, so there's a question about rhythm, and you brought up the idea of rope flow, right? So rope flow is interesting because it has a periodicity to it, right? At a given rate of the rope moving, there is a certain period of time it takes. And so it's so the rhythmic aspect of a swing or a jump may not be as perceptually apparent as a rope flow task. So then the question is, in, say, adding something like a rope flow task or a juggling task or a rope jumping task or a musical task, am I able to create an attunement to rhythm that has a transfer to their ability to have the right intention, right attention to the relationship to rhythm in the sport? I don't know.
No, I mean, because what's interesting, right,
Yeah,
too, on the basic like dynamic system stuff in the research, right? You have phase shifts as the system changes its frequency, as it becomes quicker.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, you get these shifts. And so, what's interesting too, with as you start to play with rhythm, you're going to eventually hit a point where you may see phase shifts in your movement, and it completely reorganized into something different, which is also interesting. Yeah. But anyways, to bring this to kind of a close, do you want to kind of let us know like what types of things that you're currently working on, or where people can kind of find more of your work?
Yeah. I would love to just close that thought about the rhythm thing because it's really fascinating to me, right? Like I have a long background in kickboxing, and one thing that kickboxers do is they jump rope, right? So as a kickboxer, you want to be very good at staying light on the balls of your feet and able to do that for a very long period of time. And then you want to have this ability to manipulate your opponent's rhythm. So then there's this question, is jump rope actually sport specific enough, right? Or is it sort of just like a nonsense thing that was just a tradition? So I've started playing with the David Wack rope flow stuff, and I like it. I don't know if it's really having this amazing impact on my spinal engine or whatever it is, but it feels nice and it's fun and it keeps me engaged. But I start to notice, I feel like I was always bad at jumping rope. I always felt like I wasn't very rhythmic. I'm not very good at drumming tasks and things like that. But my footwork was always pretty strong in the actual combative thing. And one thing I noticed is after the parkour stuff, my ability to produce force on the ground was so much higher than most other athletes. My elasticity allowed me to move in and out of space in ways that were really unusual for martial artists, especially martial artists my size. And it made me very weird for other people to spar. So I play with the rope flow a lot before my warm-ups. And I have the sense that it is somehow attuning my body to a sense of rhythm that is broadly useful. And we see this as also a really extremely common form of play across the world, is games of rhythm. And even work organized around rhythm is incredibly common cross-culturally, right? So think about like sea shanties, right? Mm-hmm. That's a way of organizing work and getting people together. So I don't know if we're really seeing this kind of transfer, but I think it's really worth playing with and then going back to that idea of, am I getting the feedback that I want from this, right? Am I seeing change in the direction that I'm interested in seeing change? And then, keep playing with it. So that'd be my answer to the rhythm question. So then the other question is, what am I doing?
Yeah.
What am I up to? Yeah. So it's a good question. I've been teaching retreats and workshops for 13 years with EMP. I decided after last summer, just because of family stuff and other things that I've gone through, that I needed to take a step back and kind of take a sabbatical from that. So I'm super up for teaching if people want to invite me out and do it. I just am not interested in doing the marketing and administration of things right now. It's pretty stressful. So I'm really open to working with people. I love to work with people in lots of different ways. I'm very interested in coaching. I like helping people with things. One of the areas that I'm kind of like really invested in right now is more the wisdom side of what I do, trying to help people build an ecology of practices that helps them become more virtuous and wise in the way that they're living their day-to-day life, better marriages, better family lives. That's really a big interest area of mine. So I'm very interested in working with people at a one-on-one level, sort of wisdom coaching. And I'm actually talking to a local martial arts gym right now, or a gym that's opening, about getting involved there and getting back in the kind of day-to-day grind of coaching, because it's really dissatisfying to spend all your time thinking about coaching methods and then get to coach 4 times a year. So I'm excited about the idea of being on the ground, helping people with skill acquisition day to day. And then I'm writing a lot. That's really my main kind of like professional output, is trying to put my ideas down on paper. So people can follow the Evolve Move Play Substack, and that's going to be predominantly about the call of practice and the physical practices and how do we grow in them. And then the Rafe Kelley Substack is where I'll be posting more stuff along interpersonal, anthropological, that kind of broader perspective. And I will start updating the YouTube again. There's a ton of resources for anyone who wants to find it on YouTube and Instagram. But right now, my primary creative energy is on Substack.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on today and chatting with us. Until next time.